fact is that millions of Negroes, as a result of centuries of denial and neglect, have been left bootless. It is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps.
At the dawn of emancipation, the total black wealth in America was about 0.5%. Today, that number is between 1% to 2%. So there has been practically no movement.
I mean, the most pernicious form of the racial wealth gap is when we take people, human beings, as capital for others, as being an asset by which others can be enriched, can accumulate, can pass down resources from one generation to the other.
They find themselves impoverished aliens in this affluent society. And that is a great deal that the society can and must do if the Negro is to gain the economic security that he needs.
The origins of the racial wealth gap begins when black people entered the shores of the United States as chattel capital. There were two forms in which black people served as capital. The uncompensated labor that they provided, but their sheer bodies themselves could be traded and stood as a source of wealth and wealth building for white people.
The enslavement of Black people in America is what made the US economy grow into the powerhouse that it is today. Even though most of this farming activity was going on in the southern part of the United States, businesses all over the country were involved in this. Insurance companies insured the slaves themselves. There were even slave-backed securities that could be traded by financial institutions. In essence, slavery encompassed nearly every part of the US economy at this point. At the start of the Civil War, each slave was worth an average of $1,000. That came to $4 billion at that point because there were around 4 million slaves in the US. In today's money, that comes to $42 trillion. And $42 trillion is about double the size of the current US economy.
With the 13th Amendment that freed slaves, the point is that that's not enough. When you've had centuries of literally bondage imposed upon a people, if you want true justice or true freedom, there needed to be not only that freedom from bondage, but actual accompanying of resources so that people could pursue their livelihood. Expecting a people to thrive and flourish without compensation for all that unjust harm really just set up a system for oppression and a system that was unjust.
Toward the end of the Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman made a promise to slaves that as soon as the war was over, they would be granted 40 acres of land and a mule. This idea of giving land had a dual purpose. People that supported it saw it as a way to both free the formerly enslaved from their old masters and as a way to dilute the power of these Southern landowners. But a few months later, President Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed. His vice president, Johnson, swiftly got rid of this promise.
When Andrew Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bill, he said, look, this is a white man's government. So that was the impetus. but also use this idea that the government doesn't give away land, this is capitalism. And the idea that this is a free market and laissez-faire was very much used to undercut claims of the 40 acres, while at the same time, the government is giving away free land out west through the Homestead Act.
The Homestead Acts were a series of bills meant to encourage settlement of the American West. In all, 270 million acres were given out as part of the bills. That land, which accounts for about 10% of the entire country, was mostly stolen from Native Americans, and most of the 1.5 million Americans that benefited from the Homestead Acts were white.
They were literally giveaways that provided white people ultimately a key ingredient to build wealth, and that's capital itself. And by design, black people were not included. The Homestead Act is a dramatic indicator of U.S. government facilitating the accumulation for white people and not facilitating it for black people, but it's one of many. The Homestead Act fits into a larger context that throughout our United States history, well beyond slavery. We think about racial repression and we think that with emancipation, that all of a sudden we were a free country. But a bigger point to make is that if we think about a middle class, a middle white asset building class, it was government policy that generated it.
What little economic successes black people were able to have at this time often spurred a lot of resentment among whites. This led to thousands of lynchings of black people and other violent attacks, sometimes on entire black neighborhoods and communities.
My name is Roy Wood, and I'm not ashamed to be a Klansman. Amen.
This was in the time of heavy Jim Crow, in the time of, rising Klan, and in the time where white supremacy was gaining this pseudo-scientific legitimacy.
It is the case that throughout history, not only have blacks not been permitted to accumulate land, capital, and other forms of resource to the same extent as whites, but when they were able to overcome barriers and accumulate those resources, it's always been subject to outright terror, outright seizure, because we did not have the codification that comes along with government to protect the resources of black people in the same way that it was protected for white people.
Tulsa, for example, in the 1900s, it was an oil boom with a lot of wealth that was in that community. And so they built, the Greenwood district, and the central part of the city was this black church. It was very ornate, beautiful. These places are called the Black Wall Street, where it wasn't a sharecropping market. There were land holdings. The thing that happened was that the racial resentment grew. There were, bombings and really just a complete destruction of that city, and very much stemming from that resentment.
In that one day, Black Wall Street was destroyed and 10,000 Tulsans were displaced. There's even evidence that World War I bomber planes were used to burn the town. In Tulsa alone, the property damage amounts to about $200 million in today's money. The Tulsa massacre was not an isolated incident. About 100 of these occurred between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s, destroying a substantial amount of black wealth.
On the one hand, those communities are clear examples of the ways in which black people have demonstrated they can not only survive, but it can actually thrive. But on the other hand, we romanticize the past. We describe a nostalgia as if we had these kingdoms of gold, when in reality, it was never the case that black people had wealth en masse. That said, left to our own druthers, the wealth gap is not going to be solved.
Slavery itself created a multi-trillion-dollar wealth gap. and the period immediately following slavery didn't do anything to close it. And none of that includes the one thing that most people today can trace their wealth back to: home ownership. Following the Great Depression, Congress passed a series of laws to help the country recover from the economic crisis. Among them was the 1934 National Housing Act. This law, for the first time, made home ownership affordable to working class individuals.
And that was a good thing, except for the fact that it intentionally excluded black people. The mortgage companies did not lend to black people. In fact, the federal government went the other way. Federal government as well as local governments, they facilitated the process of excluding black people from these products. And how did they do so? Neighborhoods were redlined.
The government created maps that showed the level of risk by neighborhood. These had different colors, and the riskiest was outlined in red.
This was very much a crude calculus, but sophisticated in a way that they actually had tons of maps across the country. And you would see the way that they mapped out a neighborhood, and they looked at the houses. Is it single family? Is it industrial? Is it farmland? What are the characteristics of the neighborhood? But the number one thing that they looked at is who lives there, right? So they would say, this is a black neighborhood, red line.
And naturally, what would develop? Slums. What would develop? Neighborhood degradation. When you have capital fleeing certain areas and capital being flooded into areas, the outcomes become obvious.
If you lived in a black neighborhood, and because it was a black neighborhood, you did not get that FHA mortgage, you did not get that GI Bill loan, you did not get the farm loans. So today, the legacy of those laws is that your neighborhood is very much racially coded. This is how racism gets embedded in wealth.
Word came from Capitol Hill that Congress had passed and sent to the White House the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Included in the measure was a landmark open housing bill, which, when fully effective, would forbid discrimination in approximately 80% of all housing offered for rent or for sale in the United States.
The civil rights movement, and in particular the Fair Housing Act of 1968, tried to put an end to that discrimination.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
But they didn't have much economic power, and they struggled to undo the decades of damage that had already been done. Since that time, the wealth gap has actually widened. In 1967, black families had 1/5 the wealth of white families. Today, that number is 1/7.
And that really is a legacy of the racial wealth gap. It's not just that you have more money in the bank account, your house is higher value. It is also, the opportunities, the ladders up for your kids are different in certain neighborhoods, non-existent in some neighborhoods, and quite frankly, hard to fall off of in other neighborhoods.
This story is not all dismal. Just like policy can be enacted to create these unjust disparities, likewise, policy can be enacted to rectify them. What we need today is a new policy regime that provides that resource in a way that's anti-racist so that we all can have the opportunity for capital accumulation and intergenerational transfers. We need something in perpetuity that ensures that, as a birthright, no American is excluded from the economic security that comes along with a capital endowment.